Do you know that there were no borders in Africa before 1884 when the Berlin Conference took place? During this conference, all the European colonial powers sitting in Europe divided Africa. That was done by drawing straight lines on African maps and giving different African regions to the existing colonial powers. That's how Africa came to get the borders it has today. So, with these borders, which were created by Europeans, using the policy of divide and rule, be beneficial to Africans? It means that as long as borders exist, Europe will continue to exploit African countries because they are divided. However, Julius Malema, the bold parliamentarian of South Africa, just exposed why Europe does not want borders to end in Africa. He criticized and roasted European and African leaders for their stupidity in following Europe's ideas. But what more did he say? And what does he plan to do next? Watch the video until the very end because you won't believe what Julius Malema said in the end. Let's get started. You should know that Julius Malema is a Pan-Africanist, a man who strongly believes that Africa can only become powerful and developed if all the borders inside Africa are removed. At the heart of Malema's vision is the ambition for a unified Africa, liberated from the legacies of colonialism. He passionately advocates for a singular African market and currency, encouraging economic collaboration to leverage regional strength for increased global bargaining power. His overarching objective is establishing a political federation that surpasses national borders, presenting a unified voice on the international stage. Moving beyond economic considerations, Malema places significant emphasis on the shared heritage and cultural fabric that binds Africans together. His advocacy extends to promoting African languages, traditions, and artistic expressions, aiming to cultivate a deep sense of belonging and solidarity across diverse ethnicities and geographies. In his perspective, this cultural cohesion serves as the foundation for a strong and united Africa. As a vocal critic of neo-colonialism and Western influence, Malema champions the cause of self-reliance and economic autonomy. He urges Africans to break free from the chains of exploitation, regain control over their natural resources, and chart an independent economic trajectory. He argues that this requires not only political liberation, but also intellectual and technological autonomy. Fostering a development approach rooted in the principle of by Africans for Africans, Malema contends that Africa's abundant natural wealth should be a blessing, not a curse, for its people. He advocates for transparent and accountable resource management, ensuring equitable distribution within and among African nations. According to him, this approach will combat poverty, inequality, and the resource-driven conflicts plaguing the continent. Perceiving Pan-Africanism not merely as a sentimental notion but as a pragmatic tool for tangible progress, Malema envisions regional integration as the key to unlocking economic potential, creating a larger market for African goods, and attracting foreign investment. By pooling resources and expertise, he believes African nations can collectively address shared challenges such as healthcare, education, and environmental sustainability, ultimately enhancing the quality of life for all citizens. However, for many, Pan-Africa is just a dream, and Julius Malema knows that. He knows how Europe has tried its best to scare Africans from having a united Africa. Therefore, he has opened himself, addressing all concerns Africans might have about a united Africa. Malema staunchly dismisses the significance of borders, considering them a creation of Europeans. After imposing borders in Africa, he argues that Europeans disregarded them when dealing with each other. In other words, Europeans were the ones who created borders in Africa, but in Europe, you won't see any borders. Every European can travel freely between European countries. You see, if having borders were so beneficial, Europe would be the one to have them. But the truth is, Europe is borderless, and this offers it great power and leverage on the global stage, which it does not want for Africa. Malema then talked about how these artificial borders and countries were foolishly created in Africa. He said that South Africa isn't a distinct entity or a name of a country, but rather a geographical concept, providing direction, not denoting a specific place. From his standpoint, Africa encompasses everything, including the southern part. Europeans were the ones calling it South Africa, and today, everyone thinks that this name was chosen by Africans. Malema said that the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF, Julius's political party, positions itself as an international organization, featuring the African continent in its logo instead of the South African map. Their vision is to unify Africa, advocating for a single currency, parliament, president, and military. But who is Julius Malema? Well, he is a South African parliamentarian and the head of the Economic Freedom Fighters Party. He initially aligned with the African National Congress, the political party linked to Nelson Mandela. However, discontent with the ANC led him to establish the EFF. This party champions African unity, actively advocating for the rights of Africans. They assert firmly that Europeans artificially divided Africa, creating countries that never existed in the past. Julius traces this back to the Berlin Conference in 1884, where European powers decided to partition Africa among themselves without considering existing tribes, clans, and families. From his perspective, the concept of countries in Africa is a European construct imposed for their convenience. But what was the Berlin Conference? Well, on the afternoon of Saturday, November 15, 1884, an international conference started at the official residence on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, spearheaded by the Chancellor of the newly formed German Empire. Seated around a horseshoe-shaped table were representatives from every European country, excluding Switzerland, and delegates from the United States and the Ottoman Empire. A sizable map of Africa, characterized by Nigerian historian Professor Godfrey Uzo-Igwe as drooping down like a question mark, adorned the wall, providing the sole clue about the purpose of this gathering. Spanning 104 days, with a brief break for Christmas and the New Year, the West African Conference of Berlin concluded on February 26, 1885. Contrary to popular belief, the delegates did not start the scramble, as it was already in progress. However, the genuine impact of the Berlin Conference was more insidious, with consequences echoing through the years to the present day. It established the rules for the conquest and partition of Africa, legitimizing the perception of Africa as an outsider's playground, its mineral wealth as a resource for the global community rather than for Africans, and its destiny as a matter beyond the control of Africans. From the beginning, the conference outlined its priorities, recognizing the interests of commercial and industrial nations, the authority of states and powers over Congo regions, and, to a lesser extent, the interests of native populations. Significantly, sovereignty issues were intentionally avoided, and the legitimacy of claiming someone else's land and resources remained unquestioned. Africans were notably absent from the table, and their opinions were deemed unnecessary. American journalist Daniel De Leon characterized the conference as a unique event in political science, highlighting its diplomatic facade and economic essence. Despite being presented as a humanitarian summit, its agenda was predominantly economic. The Lagos Observer labeled it a colossal robbery, and 6 years later, a Lagos newspaper editor likened its legacy to the slave trade. The outcome was the General Act, signed and ratified by all nations at the table except the United States. Key features included the establishment of a free trade regime across the middle of Africa, contributing to the acknowledgement of the Congo Free State and its subsequent 13-year horror, the abolition of the overland slave trade, and the principle of effective occupation. Although the attempt to create a free trade area in Africa ultimately failed, the principle of effective occupation became a catalyst for the military conquest of the African continent, profoundly impacting its inhabitants. You should know that before the conference, 80% of Africa remained under traditional and local control, with Europeans exerting influence primarily along the coast. Following the conference, they initiated the claiming of inland territories, resulting in a patchwork of geometric boundaries imposed over indigenous cultures and regions in Africa. However, to legitimize their claims to African land, European states had to demonstrate their ability to administer these areas. Securing military victories often proved to be the easier part. The real challenge emerged when they had to govern, grappling with a complex environment of fluid identities, cultures, and languages. Consequently, Europeans undertook the task of restructuring Africans into units they could understand and control. Professor Terence Ranger observed that the colonial period was characterized by the systematic inventions of African traditions, ethnicity, customary law, traditional religion. Before colonialism, Africa was marked by pluralism, flexibility, and multiple identities. Afterward, African identities of tribe, gender, and generation were constrained by the rigidities of invented tradition. The inaugural International Conference on Africa established a precedent for how the world engages with the continent. Presently, Africa is still predominantly perceived as a source of raw materials for the external world and a battleground for their competition. Conferences about the continent are rarely held on African soil and frequently overlook the perspectives of ordinary Africans. The sight of African heads of state gathering in foreign capitals to seek favors echoes the Sultan of Zanzibar's plea to attend a conference where he would be the main course. Despite gaining independence in the 1950s and 1960s, many African countries have continued along the detrimental path outlined in Berlin. Former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere remarked, "We have artificial nations carved out at the Berlin Conference in 1884. And today, we are struggling to build these nations into stable units of human society. We are in danger of becoming the most balkanized continent in the world." Ethnicity and tribalism persist as challenges in African politics. Jean Niemann, Peter Muller, and Harm de Bly noted in their book, Geography. Realms, Regions, and Concepts. The Berlin Conference was Africa's undoing in more ways than one. The colonial powers superimposed their domains on the African continent. By the time independence returned to Africa, the realm had acquired a legacy of political fragmentation that could neither be eliminated nor made to operate satisfactorily. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. 137 years after Berlin, it might be time for reflection. While it's impossible to reverse the past, Africans could benefit from contemplating the events since then. Teaching the genuine history of the continent's subjugation could counter the myths of ancient hatreds said to fuel conflicts. Africans might choose to convene on the continent to deliberate and determine the relationship they want with the rest of the world, rather than having it dictated to them from abroad. This is why today, you can witness people from the same tribe living on opposite sides of a country, individuals of the same tribe speaking the same language residing in two separate countries. This occurs because, in essence, they are one and the same people. Malema actively advocates and reminds people that we constitute a unified African community, emphasizing the idea that Africa is a single entity. He encourages rejecting the fear that people from different regions might enter your country if borders are eliminated. His ultimate objective is an Africa without borders. He argues that the root cause of our fragmentation and defeat lies in the fact that our adversaries thrive when we are divided. Malema strongly supports the elimination of borders, asserting that the division caused by borders serves the interests of our enemies. He highlights the contrast with Europe, where there are no borders between European countries. He questions those who oppose removing borders, using the example of Italians not migrating to Britain, despite the absence of borders within Europe. It completely removes the fear that all people will rush toward a single wealthy country in the region if borders are removed. But the truth is, before the Berlin Conference, the whole of Africa was populated, despite having regions where wealth was plentiful. Despite this, people did not choose to desert the regions where their generations lived. The same goes for today. If borders are removed, people might like to travel, but the majority of them will never migrate to other areas. Malema challenges the prevailing belief among many South Africans that opening borders will lead to an influx of Zimbabweans and individuals from other nations seeking a better life. He dismisses this notion as a misconception and argues that there are existing ways for Zimbabweans to enter South Africa. Despite this, many Zimbabweans choose to remain in their home country. Malema argues that the reluctance of Italians to move to Britain, even without borders, illustrates the unity and shared enjoyment among European countries. He underscores the importance for Africans to embrace one another and dismisses the unfounded fear that opening borders will result in undesirable migration. Malema argues that the notion of people arriving to take jobs is unfounded, challenging this perspective by firmly stating its inaccuracy. His standpoint is notably distinct among politicians. He openly declared his willingness to welcome Africans in South Africa, making it explicit that those who disagree with his commitment to African unity should never vote for him. This bold position contrasts with the typical political approach of making promises solely to secure votes and power. He emphasizes that there is no fence between the Free State and its neighboring provinces, and highlights that people from Lotu move freely between the provinces without any complications. This serves as an illustration supporting his argument that the absence of borders does not automatically lead to mass movement between regions. This is something to be understood. When people know that all of Africa is one and they can go anywhere, it will feel like a country. Therefore, the argument stands that if people living in less wealthy parts of the country do not migrate to wealthy parts, it means that mass migration will never happen. Before the existence of Malema and the EFF, there was never a fence between Zimbabwe and Limpopo. Despite the lack of a fence, individuals in Zimbabwe choose to stay there. Malema underscores the notion that these people should come here, questioning why they haven't done so when there is no fence. He highlights the irony that, even without a fence, there is a gate, emphasizing the illogical nature of the situation. Malema implies that our leadership is foolish, since there is no fence but a gate. Malema elaborates on the situation between South Africa and Zimbabwe, stressing the absence of a fence that would ostensibly prevent Zimbabweans from entering South Africa. He challenges the belief that all Zimbabweans desire to come to South Africa, pointing out that people still reside in Zimbabwe. Malema amusingly observes that despite the lack of a fence, there is a gate. He uses this absurdity to critique those who oppose African unity, suggesting that such opposition arises from a perceived threat, as a unified Africa would stand on equal ground with other major global powers. Malema advises people not to be persuaded by the notion that removing borders will lead to an influx of individuals taking jobs, dismissing it as nonsensical. That's when you should know that Europe introduced the concept of xenophobia to Africa. This created conflicts and hostilities among African nations, driven by fear or hostility towards outsiders, but this was artificially imposed by European colonial powers. Before the Berlin Conference, Africa showcased a diverse landscape of tribes, clans, and communities. These groups coexisted with a sense of unity, sharing common cultural and historical bonds. However, the Berlin Conference arbitrarily drew borders across Africa, without considering existing tribal or cultural divisions. This process resulted in the creation of modern African nation-states, often comprising diverse ethnic groups forced together within a single political boundary. The imposition of these borders and the establishment of distinct nations contributed to the fragmentation of African unity. The concept of xenophobia, or the fear of foreigners, was developed to deepen divisions among the diverse ethnicities and nationalities now residing within these artificially drawn borders. The motivation behind this manipulation is linked to European colonial interests. By sowing division and fostering a sense of otherness among the indigenous African populations, European powers could more easily maintain control and exploit the continent's resources. In response to this perspective, there is often an appeal for African unity. Advocates argue that overcoming xenophobia and recognizing shared histories and cultures could contribute to a more robust and unified Africa. Julius Malema's fundamental vision is to imagine an Africa without borders, a continent where Africans can move freely, visit each other, and nurture mutual understanding. He envisions an Africa where Africans can invest in different countries, stimulate development, and bring their skills to contribute. This vision surrounds a united Africa, a federation with a single government, and a shared political mindset that can drive the entire continent toward progress. Malema argues that if Africa unites as one country, it can stand stronger than the rest of the world. This unity, he asserts, facilitates addressing global challenges and resisting external pressures, highlighting the vulnerability of small, individual countries. Malema frankly stated that if there were no white people in South Africa, many Africans might not opt to come. The perception is that the white population in South Africa, historically associated with development, has played a role in constructing infrastructure such as roads, buildings, hospitals, and other structures contributing to the country's progress. Malema draws a contrast with other African nations where, historically, white individuals arrived to exploit resources and departed after fulfilling their interests. Numerous individuals arrive in South Africa firmly believing in their right to the land and aspiring to contribute to the long-term development of infrastructure. This perspective stands in contrast to other regions of Africa, where the primary focus on infrastructure was establishing routes from mines to the sea for rapid resource extraction. Those choosing South Africa as their destination often see opportunities for development, a perception influenced by the presence of the white population. Some South Africans, especially those facing limited opportunities, express concerns about incoming Africans taking jobs across various sectors, including security, retail, and produce sales. But let's know how the European-created borders have made Africa suffer. From 2020 to 2022, authorities in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia discovered the bodies of more than 100 undocumented migrants from Ethiopia who tragically succumbed to hunger or suffocated while making their way to South Africa. You see, these are the people who are struggling and losing their lives just to go to a place where they belong. As explained by the African Union, internal migration within Africa is propelled by diverse factors, including the pursuit of enhanced socio-economic conditions through employment, environmental considerations, and seeking refuge from political instability, conflict, and civil war. Labor migration, particularly of low-skilled workers, remains a consistent form of movement within the continent. However, many immigration regulations in Africa lack visa provisions for such workers and economic refugees. Consequently, numerous desperate immigrants resort to human smugglers for assistance in reaching countries perceived to offer superior employment opportunities. After taking significant personal risks to migrate, undocumented migrants encounter new threats and dangers upon reaching their destinations. In South Africa, Operation Dudula, an anti-migrant organization, is actively fostering a hostile environment for undocumented African migrants. Since January, the group has been impeding undocumented migrants' access to healthcare at a central Johannesburg clinic and attempting to expel undocumented children from government schools in Diepsloot, a densely populated settlement. Operation Dudula also targets migrants involved in small businesses, market stalls, and informal shops, demanding their closure and departure. However, South Africa, its authorities, and all African countries just don't have the time to think that they are following Europe's idea of Africa. Using force to stop Africans coming to an African country is what Europeans used to do. Despite influential figures like Julius Malema and PLO Lumumba advocating for an Africa without borders and unity among Africans, this enlightened thinking encounters obstacles. The African Union's 2018 adoption of the Protocol to the Treaty, establishing the African Economic Community, which promotes free movement, still lacks comprehensive support. Only 32 out of 55 African countries have signed it, and only 4, Rwanda, Niger, São Tomé and Príncipe, and Mali, have authorized it. The resistance from numerous African governments to continent-wide free movement, coupled with their inefficient attempts to regulate irregular migration, underscores a lack of understanding of the substantial benefits of migration. Migration, whether irregular or not only benefits migrants and their families but also enriches the communities hosting them. However, because African countries are trying to preserve the structure that suppressed Africa, they are doing the work as a colonial power. This is the time when Pan-Africanists like Julius Malema should be heard and understood. Isn't it true that African borders were created so European colonizers could exploit Africa without resistance? What do you think? Are the borders in Africa still serving Europe? Let us know whether you agree with Julius Malema that there should not be any borders in Africa. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.